introduced. The House comes to order. The House comes to questions for oral answer. Question number 1, in the name of the Honourable Annette King.
Tēnā koe, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Health. Did each District Health Board get a funding increase in Budget 2016 sufficient for them to meet all health demographics, wage and inflationary cost pressures? If not, which ones did not?
The Honourable Dr. Jonathan Coleman.
Just before I answer, I'd just like to congratulate the Labor Party on its 100 years, and in particular Mrs King, who seems to have been here for much of it.
Order.
To the answer.
I think order. The first part, I think the House. Order. I think the first part, I think the House should take and note with congratulations, and the second part, I think, should take the opportunity of acknowledging the huge contribution the Honourable Annette King has made to this House. And now, if we could have the answer to the question.
Right, yep. All right. Generally speaking, yes. Though you never know the actual pressures such as inflation until the year is ended. Certainly the extra $468 million going to District Health Board services this year will ensure that the $150 million underfunding of DHBs delivered in Labor's last budget is never repeated.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, the Honourable Annette King.
So what is the total estimated DHB pressures in dollar terms for 2017-18 provided to him by the Ministry of Health?
The Honourable Dr. Jonathan Coleman.
I haven't got that figure with me, but it's publicly available.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, the Honourable Annette King.
What is the total amount in dollar terms of efficiency savings he requires from DHBs in 2016-17, on top of the close to 900 million DHBs have had to find since 2011-12?
The Honourable Dr. Jonathan
Well, it
Coleman.
wouldn't be too far off the automatic 0.5% dividend that Labor required in terms of efficiencies.
Order. No, that's not the question.
Haven't got the full figure with me.
Then the question has now been addressed. The Honourable Annette King, supplementary question.
Yes, I have got supplementaries. Why didn't the following DHBs, according to updated figures from the Ministry of Health, receive sufficient funding to cover all their health pressures in 2016? Auckland, Canterbury, Capital and Coast, Counties Manukau, Hawke's Bay, Hutt Valley, Nelson Marlborough, South Canterbury, Taranaki, Wairarapa, Waitemata and West Coast, 12 in total.
The Honourable Dr.
Mr.
Jonathan
Speaker,
Coleman.
that's completely incorrect. That $468 million will pretty much cover all pressures, but of course we won't know the inflation figure until the end of the year. What I can say is over the last 8 years, the money that the government has put into health has fully funded all pressures, including inflation, and the facts bear that out.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Point of order, the Honourable.
I seek leave to table information sourced from the Parliamentary Library using Vote Health Estimates Questions 2016, showing the 12 DHBs that were not funded to their full extent.
On the basis of the answer that was given, I will put the leave for that to be tabled. Leave is sought to table that particular information prepared by the Parliamentary Library. Is there any objection? There is none. It can be tabled.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Point of order, the Honourable Dr. Jonathan Coleman.
I seek leave to table figures showing that this year the allocation to DHBs covered all pressures.
Order. I just need to know the source of the papers the members seeking to table.
Ministry of Health.
Are they publicly available?
No.
I'll put the leave. Leave is sought to table that information. Order. The House will decide. Leave is sought to table that information. Is there any objection? There is none. It can be tabled.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, the Honourable Annette King.
Is he satisfied that the impact on Canterbury DHB not receiving sufficient funding to meet all their pressures means that they are now looking at, quote, the financial sustainability, end quote, of services leading to cuts and reconfigurations, for example, that they have given in older persons' health?
The Honourable Dr. Jonathan
Mr. Speaker,
Coleman.
that's completely incorrect. Look, the Canterbury DHB is receiving an extra $44 million this year, and this government has supported Canterbury Health right throughout the difficult last 5 years. An extra $106 million has gone in there, $20 million specifically for mental health services, on top of the $86 million that have been put in there to make good on the deficit position.
Supplementary question,
Supplementary
Mr. Speaker.
question, the Honourable Annette King.
What changes to the care of older people living at home will be required to enable Capital and Coast and Hutt Valley DHB to save $7.6 million as part of his enforced saving review?
The Honourable Dr.
I don't
Jonathan
know that
Coleman.
there's going to be any changes there, but what I can tell you is deficits across DHBs are about $50 million and dropping, quite different to 8 years ago when they were $150 million and increasing.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order, the Honourable Annette King.
I seek leave to table the Capital and Coast DHB board papers dated the 2nd of February 2016, headed Procurement of Home Care Support Services.
Leaders sought to table those particular board papers. Is there any objection? There is none that can be tabled.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary question, the Honourable Annette King.
Why doesn't he just fess up to the government's underfunding the health budget by a whopping $1.72 billion now, according to independent figures, instead of blaming DHBs and sending in expensive consultants to review, only to be forced to cough up with extra money later on?
The Honourable
Well, those
Dr.
aren't
Jonathan
independent figures. That's the CTU figure, and it's incorrect. The fact is the health budget's increased by $4 billion. But look, we're about services. Mrs King and Labor are just about quibbling over money. So there's more operations, more appointments, more doctors. No one's going to Australia for cancer services. And I tell you what, the Labor Party cannot name one single service that hasn't improved in the last 8 years. That's a fact.
Order. Question